What's the creepiest thing that has happened to you that creeps you out to this day? Story 1. When I was 6, 28 years ago, my mom and dad took me and my younger sister to a Major League Baseball game, leaving my grandmother to babysit my youngest sister. When we got back, my grandmother told my parents that two men had come by the house with photography equipment and asked whether a young girl with red curly hair lived there, saying that they had spotted her and that she would be a great child model for some advertising work they were doing. When my grandmother said she was not home, they said they would come back another time. My grandmother and mom did not think much about it, but my dad said something was not right and called the police. 15 minutes later, several Federal Bureau of Investigation agents showed up and began conducting interviews with my grandmother and my parents, while I ran around and showed the agents my Matchbox police helicopter. It turned out we had been targeted by a child theft ring. The photographers would take a bunch of photos and wait until the toddler threw a tantrum. Then they would ask the mother to go grab a toy to keep the child entertained. And while the mother was out of the room, they would grab the child and run, leaving everything else behind. The Federal Bureau of Investigation told my parents that my sister had already been sold and would have been out of the country within 24 hours if they had gotten her, and we were advised to change preschools and other aspects of our daily routine. It still gives me chills to think about what could have happened to her. And needless to say, my mom became pretty overprotective, as it was a few years before she even trusted us with a babysitter. Story 2. When my mom was a young girl, she and her mother lived in a trailer in the backyard of a family member's house. And my mom was about 12 at the time when the man in the neighboring house started to stare at her from time to time. She got a creepy feeling from him, but figured it was just a harmless, lonely man. One night, when my mom was alone, she heard something on the roof of their trailer. Then she heard what sounded like footsteps slowly walking along the metal rooftop. Because they were extremely poor at the time and did not have a phone, she eventually ran out of the trailer and into the house without looking at the roof. When her uncle went outside to investigate, nothing was on the roof. A few weeks went by with no incidents, and my mom figured she must have been overly scared for no reason. More disturbing things would randomly happen, but only when she was alone, and it was always spaced out by a week or two. If I remember correctly, this went on for maybe a couple of months before it stopped completely. Months passed without any strange incidents at all until one night my mom woke up to the trailer being unbelievably hot, and she could feel the heater running at full blast. She got out of bed and was about to go to the control for the trailer's heater, but she was overcome with a bad feeling and decided to go into the house instead. Her uncle went out to the trailer and noticed that the lock on the door was broken or tampered with, and he looked inside quickly but did not see anything. His wife made him call the police, and when they arrived, they searched the trailer and found one of the kitchen knives hidden behind a chair next to the heating controller. They suspected that the neighbor had gone into the trailer, turned the heat up, and crouched behind the chair waiting for my mom to come by. And then who knows what would have happened. It has been a long time since I heard the story, but from what I remember, the police questioned the neighbor and could not really do anything about it. Luckily, my mom and grandmother were able to move out of that town shortly after. My mom told me that about 5 years later, she was visiting other family members who lived in a nearby town and saw the neighbor at a grocery store, and she ran out before he saw her. Story 3. Just a few months ago, while I was still in school, I rented an old house with two of my friends, and I lived in the basement while they each had a room upstairs. Several strange things happened to me while I was living in that basement. The first was that I had just gotten a dog and he was about 4 months old at the time, and every now and then, right when I turned the television off to go to sleep, my dog would start whining and growling at one corner of my room. He usually would not get on my bed because he was not allowed, but during these moments he would jump on my bed and get as close to me as he could, all without ever taking his eyes off that corner. This happened about 5 times over the course of 4 months. Then, toward the end of the school year when I was about to move out, the scariest thing that has ever happened to me occurred. Under our stairs there was a small door that led to a tight space with a dirt floor, and there was also a really strange old wooden piece that looked like part of a map nailed to the inside of the door, making it a pretty unsettling place. Up until the day before this incident, we had kept a small chair in front of this door that I used to lay my coats and other things on, but we had some friends over the night before, so we brought that chair upstairs. It was dark, probably 8 in the evening, and I had just been upstairs in the kitchen, And as I stepped off the stairs and was about to open the door to my room, the door to the small closet under the stairs opened extremely slowly with the loudest creak I have ever heard in my life. I stood completely still, frozen in fear, staring at the closet and waiting for whatever was about to come out. And I literally stood there for about 5 minutes, absolutely terrified. Eventually, I opened the door to my room and locked it as fast as I could. And I was not sure if either of my roommates were home, so I called my female roommate and found out that she was there. I spent the rest of that night upstairs with her, still too scared to go back downstairs, and I should mention that I am a 21-year-old man who does not scare easily. I know many people will probably say it was the wind or the fact that I had just come down the stairs, just as my roommates did, but I have had those things happen before and only felt mildly unsettled, and this was different because the second I heard that closet open and saw it moving so slowly, I felt pure terror. And it honestly felt like there was someone or something else in the room with me that wanted me to see that door open. Story 4. Well, I am late, but whatever. So about 2 years ago, I was in my room reading a book when I heard it, soft as could be, two little girls giggling, and not just any giggle, but the kind of giggling you hear in horror movies. I immediately put down my book and listened, and after about a minute of holding my breath, I decided it must have come from outside. Then that night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it again. Two little girls giggling, and now it was 2 in the morning, and I was pretty sure there were not two little girls outside my window at that time of night, so I began to panic. I sat up in my bed and waited for what felt like forever, just listening, and then I heard it again. I jumped out of my bed and spent the rest of the night in the guest room, and by the next morning I was convinced my room was haunted. For the next week, I avoided my room and spent my nights in the guest room without my family knowing because I was afraid to tell anyone for fear that I was going crazy or that they would not believe me. Every time I spent more than an hour in my room, I would hear those two little girls giggle, and by the end of the week, I was a complete mess, barely sleeping and absolutely terrified of my room. Then one morning, my brother walked up to me and asked if I was deaf or something, which obviously confused me. And after questioning him further, he told me about a small device he had placed in my room. Apparently, it was some kind of prank device that is easily hidden and can make a variety of noises, and my brother had chosen the extremely creepy little girl's giggling sound. He wondered why I had not heard it or said anything all week, and I honestly wanted to punch him in the face. My room was not haunted after all, and the moral of the story is that sometimes your brother is just a jerk. Story 5. I supervised the night crew from 4 in the afternoon until midnight at a Subway restaurant. And while the day crew has never mentioned it, the night crew always makes jokes about our sub ghost, although I have stopped being sure that it is actually a joke. Now hear me out. I am not saying the Subway I work at is haunted, but I am also not saying it is not haunted. It is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So after midnight, just one person stays by themselves until the day crew comes in around 6 in the morning. And I always spend at least an hour a night alone, and quite a while with just one other person. Sometimes we hear voices, the music is off, there are only one or two of us, but we can hear people having a conversation, even though it is too quiet to make out words. The first time I heard voices, I looked at my supervisor and asked if she heard them too, and she looked me in the eyes and casually said, "Yes, it is the sub-ghosts talking." It sounds like a joke, but now I realize that when I am training someone new on the late shift, I have given the casual, "it is just the sub-ghost" response more times than I can remember. There are voices, there are strange crashing noises, and sometimes when no one is in the room, things fall off the counters for no clear reason. Once our owner bought new automatic paper towel dispensers to replace the old push dispensers, and I was alone right before the overnight employee came in when I heard a towel dispense. I walked around the corner and everything was quiet, and I was about to walk away when another towel came out, then another, and finally it went full sub-ghost and dispensed the entire roll continuously without stopping, much like when a cat figures out how to unroll toilet paper. It only stopped when there was no paper left and no one else was around, but a few days later the owner switched them back, so we now have the manual paper towel dispensers again. If there is a sub-ghost, it is friendly, and I do not really mind, and while the day crew is completely oblivious, Those of us on the night crew become very familiar with the sandwich spook, and its presence is so constant that it is a strange night when something is not explained by saying, "sub-ghost," and the voices have almost become comforting. Story 6. When I lived in South Africa, I traveled a lot with a Christian missionary and humanitarian aid worker, and while he handled the spiritual side of things, I tended to work more with the local people, mostly Josa, helping them with non-spiritual issues. In July of 2010, we went to a village in the middle of nowhere, and as soon as we stepped out of the truck, we knew something was wrong. We had not been able to contact our person in the village all day, and there was no one around at all, and Piet and I went from house to house looking for anyone, but everywhere was completely empty. Eventually, we saw a figure run around the corner of a building on the far side of the village, and it was a young woman, completely naked, running straight toward us. Her arms were flailing, and she was running almost like an animal, occasionally dropping to all fours and then back on her feet. As she got closer, Piet told me to get back in the truck, and then he yelled at me to get in the truck. And I had seen this man watch a Xhosa witch doctor burn a dozen chickens alive without reacting at all. So when he completely lost control, I knew it was serious. I closed the truck door as she reached us, and she was covered in blood, with cuts all over her face, arms, and chest. One of her ears was missing or badly damaged. It was hard to tell because there was so much blood. Her teeth were bloody, and she had a look of absolute wild rage in her eyes. The screeching sound she made was unlike anything I have ever heard before or since, and I can still hear it clearly in my mind, because looking into her face and seeing her wide, unhinged eyes and open mouth as she made that sound froze me in my seat. Piet had started the truck and was already reversing up the dirt track, but she followed us, and he turned the vehicle while she scratched at the windows and metal, then sped off up the track. She chased us, and while she obviously could not keep up, for a short time I thought she might, because I had never seen anyone run that fast barefoot. The drive back to our base town was almost completely silent, and I spent most of it focusing on the sound of my own breathing and the rumble of the road. And when I finally asked Piet what that was and what we should do, he said the woman was almost certainly mentally ill and had suffered a severe break, but that the locals would have immediately believed she was possessed. He said that if she did not kill herself, the other villagers likely would within days, and he suggested that the villagers had probably gathered in one house for safety. I saw a lot of deeply disturbing things in that country. Story 7. My boyfriend works the night shift, and I was asleep alone in the house when I was woken up in the middle of the night by my puppy whining in the living room, and I assumed it was because he wanted to go outside. I was just about to open the back door when I heard a strange scratching and clicking sound at the front door, like someone was sticking something into the lock. I went to check and could see the silhouette of someone standing there through the window in the door, and then I noticed there was a second figure in the living room window, although it was too dark to make out any features. I knew they could see me because I did not have any blinds at that point, and they just stood there. I completely panicked and called the police, then called my dad, and I huddled in the kitchen out of sight of any windows and waited for someone to come. My parents live across town and showed up before the police, and by that point the people were gone, but the neighbors across the street were awake and had seen the car. I ended up staying at my parents' place that night, and when I came home the next morning, I noticed that the basement window had been partially kicked in. I had a security system installed the very next day, and I still have no idea who it was. Story 8. Kidnapping attempt in the 1980s. This happened in a Sacramento neighborhood late at night when I was visiting a friend, and I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, and three of us walked out to go play at a park in elementary school several blocks away at around 10 in the evening. We were playing frisbee in the street in front of the school when our frisbee landed in the road just as a white van pulled up and stopped, as if to let us retrieve it. I walked toward the van, grabbed the frisbee, and then moved to the side to allow the van to pass. But as it did, the sliding door opened and a man dressed in black like a ninja came flying out and tried to grab me. He was wearing a harness, and the van had been rigged with a telescoping mechanism that allowed him to extend out about 5 feet while hanging from the harness, similar to how people appear to be flying in some haunted houses, and it was operated by another person inside the van who was also dressed in black. meaning there were at least 3 people involved. I barely dodged his attempt to grab me, and all 3 of us ran toward the elementary school, jumped the fence, which was about 6 feet tall, ran along the fence through bushes, and then climbed a second fence that was maybe 15 feet high, which allowed us to get inside the school grounds. We were absolutely terrified and could hear the van driving around, assuming they were chasing us, and we eventually found a way to get onto the roof of the school from the inside, which felt like a miracle. And from there, we watched the van drive around the school for at least 30 minutes in an obvious attempt to find us. That scared us even more because you would think kidnappers would flee, but it seemed like they were worried we could identify them. And since this was before cell phones, we stayed on the roof until about 45 minutes after we last saw the van. It also appeared that some of them were searching for us on foot, which only added to the fear, and eventually we escaped and went back to my friend's house and never told anyone in our families because we were afraid of getting in trouble. Story 9. I am female, and I am 21 now, but when I was 4 years old, my sister had just turned 16 and had recently gotten her driver's license, which she was extremely excited about. It was probably only September since she got her license in July, and my sister is from my dad's first marriage. So she lived with her mom and stepdad while I lived with our dad and my mom, and our houses were about 30 minutes apart. My dad worked late hours, and my mom traveled frequently for work, so I spent a lot of time with babysitters until my sister got her license. And my dad finally gave her permission to pick me up after school and take me to her mom's house until he was off work, which made her incredibly excited to finally be able to drive. Even though I was only 4, I remember this event very vividly, although there are parts I have understandably forgotten over the years, and it took years for my sister to even ask me if I remembered it. But when I told her everything I did remember, which was about 80%, she filled in the rest. It was one of the first times she was allowed to pick me up alone, and almost as soon as we pulled onto the main road, a white pickup truck swerved behind us, which was strange, but did not seem alarming at first. After a few turns, my sister noticed the truck was still following us, even switching lanes right behind her every time she did, and being a somewhat paranoid person, she tested it by changing lanes several times, hearing his tires squeal as he aggressively cut back behind us. She told me not to worry, and I remained an oblivious little kid. Even though she looked scared, the man became increasingly angry, and while I do not remember his face, I clearly remember the expression of pure hatred on it, as he honked repeatedly, drove extremely close to us, swerved back and forth, pulled alongside us, and made threatening gestures. We eventually stopped at a large 4-way stoplight where we were the first car in our lane, and he used the empty lane to pull in front of us in the intersection and block our car, then got out and stormed toward us screaming so violently that his face appeared almost purple. Neither of us remembers what he was yelling, but he lifted his shirt to show us a gun, pointed at it and at us, and kept approaching, and my sister put her arm over me, told me to close my eyes, and drove straight through the intersection, risking a crash rather than staying there. He jumped back into his truck and followed us, and since my house was closer than hers, she drove there. But he followed and blocked us in the driveway, got out again, and walked toward us with the gun, forcing her to swerve across the lawn and back onto the road. He continued following us, pulling alongside and hitting our car, trying to force us into traffic on a major road next to our neighborhood, even placing the gun on his dashboard and making a slashing motion across his throat as a threat. There was a gas station nearby, and my sister calmly but firmly told me that when we stopped, I needed to unbuckle and run inside immediately and tell the cashier to call emergency services because a dangerous man was following us. And when we pulled in, she stopped the car, and I did exactly that, with her right behind me. The man pulled into the parking lot and went through my sister's car, but by the time police arrived, he was gone, and they never found him or learned what provoked him. And the only things missing from the car were my sister's identification and the cash she had with her. Story 10. This did not happen to me, but it happened to my cousin and was witnessed by another cousin and an aunt. And for the sake of the story, I will say my younger cousin's name is Jenny, my older cousin's name is Jane, and my aunt's name is Mara. Jenny and Mara were in New York City to visit Jane while she was in her master's program, and they toured around the city and stayed at a hotel, I think somewhere in Manhattan. In the middle of the night, Jenny started having nightmares. And after talking to her later, she described something that matched sleep paralysis perfectly, because she said she felt like she was being pulled in and suffocated by a massive television that forced her through the bed and into the ground. She woke up screaming and crying and ended up throwing up and losing control of herself in the bathroom. And my Aunt Myra went to help her and clean her up. And after some time, they both went back to bed. A while later, my aunt checked on Jenny again and found her staring directly at her with a completely blank expression, still asleep but with her eyes fully open, which seriously unsettled her, especially since she and my cousin Jane were also hearing whispering and what sounded like children's voices. They left the hotel first thing in the morning, but the strangest part came later when there was a photo of my family taken at Serendipity, where Jenny's lips appeared completely black, not edited or shadowed, but perfectly black and symmetrical, almost like she was wearing makeup or lipstick, even though she was not. I have seen the photo myself, and to this day, none of us know why her lips showed up like that in the picture. Story 11. My parents were on their honeymoon in Key West, and when they arrived at the hotel to check in, they were told that their room would be non-smoking. So because my dad was a smoker, they asked for a different room. They got the room switched and went up, and as they got off the elevator, the smell of fresh paint was overwhelming, and down the hall there was a painter with all his supplies laid out painting the wall. My parents walked past him and casually greeted him, but he did not acknowledge them at all, which they brushed off at first. When they got to their room, the smell of paint was even stronger, to the point that it was unbearable. So they went back down to the front desk to ask for another room. When they explained what was going on, the attendant looked confused and told them there was no scheduled painting on that floor that day, but still agreed to move them. My parents went back up to grab their luggage, and when they arrived, the painter was completely gone. All the supplies were gone, and within about 10 minutes, the smell of paint had vanished entirely. At that point, they were unsettled but decided not to dwell on it and went to their new room. The next morning on their way to breakfast, they overheard a tour guide talking to a group and mentioning the floor they had originally been assigned, explaining that many years ago, a painter working on that floor had fallen down the elevator shaft and died. My parents do not usually believe in anything paranormal, but that experience deeply disturbed them because they never found a logical explanation for it. Story 12. I have two experiences that still bother me years later, one involving Pop-Tarts and the other involving a cabin in Oregon. And the Pop-Tart one still hits me every now and then when I wake up in the middle of the night. I was around 17 years old and had gotten home from work pretty late, went straight to my room to change and realized I was hungry. And it was probably around 1 in the morning, so I did not want to cook anything and risk waking my parents. I went into the kitchen quietly and started digging through the cupboards looking for something quick to eat. Our kitchen door led to the backyard, and it was an old wooden door with a metal security gate installed on the outside, the kind with holes too small for insects to get through, so we could leave the wooden door open in the summer, and my dad had also installed a motion-activated security light that usually only turned on when I let my dog outside. That night, my dog was already in my room waiting for me to come back. I eventually found some Pop-Tarts, opened them right there, and started eating them as is. And while I was standing there, I heard a faint whistling sound coming from outside through the open door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but I realized it was a distinct tune, clearly part of a song, sounding both happy and sad at the same time. After about 20 seconds, I assumed one of my friends down the block was messing with me, and right as I had that thought, the security light suddenly turned on. I looked around but saw no one, and the whistling continued, which sent me into a quiet panic as I stood there frozen, staring outside. After about a minute, the whistling got louder, and I saw the handle on the metal security door start moving up and down, even though I could clearly see through the door that no one was there, and the light was still on, giving me a clear view. At that point, I dropped the Pop-Tarts, ran back to my room, slammed and locked the door, and hid under the blankets with my dog and a bat. And after that night, I never went into the kitchen late at night again. Story 13. When I was about 6 years old and playing with the kid next door one afternoon, the lights suddenly went out, and we were by ourselves because all of her family members were at the hospital with her mom, who was suffering from leukemia at the time. When the blackout happened, my friend went out onto the porch to do something I do not remember, and I was standing by the door looking outside when something made me turn back toward the house. In the living room, there was a shadow figure walking around, tall and dark with no recognizable features at all, almost like someone wearing a black full bodysuit, but not as solid as a real person would look in a room, and it was not blurry either. I noticed it moving around the room as if it were looking for something, and at that point I was not scared because I had never seen anything like it before, and I was a curious child. The next thing I knew, it went up to the second floor, and I followed it, watching the shadow figure walk around the bedroom again as if searching for something. Then it started moving toward the wall on my right, and I remember thinking, oh no, is it going to disappear? Is it going to disappear? And sure enough, it vanished straight through the wall. I forgot about all of this until I was around 17 years old and watching one of those real ghost story shows on television in Japan, the ones they show every summer season before the Obon holidays. One man talked about his own experience seeing shadow figures in a hospital where he had been confined for a few months, and he mentioned that he sometimes saw them beside people who were about to die. I felt chills run up and down my spine when I heard that, because I remembered that my friend's mom died about a week after I saw that shadow figure. And ever since then, I have had my own understanding of what that dark figure might have been, either death itself or whatever it is that comes to take you when you die. Story 14. This happened to me back in 10th grade when I could not sleep and was feeling restless. So I decided to take a walk along the greenway near my house. Most people would hesitate to walk through the woods alone in the middle of the night, but it was a safe neighborhood, and I knew the greenway like the back of my hand. No more than 5 minutes into the walk, I heard a girl singing, and I immediately recognized the tune as Camptown Races. I looked around for her, but it was pitch black, and not wanting to suddenly startle her, I called out that she had a nice voice, but there was no reply and she just kept singing. I kept walking, but the singing did not get any farther away, which made me wonder if she was following me or if we were just walking in the same direction. I made a sharp turn onto another path, and the singing followed. Then I made another sharp turn, and it followed again. And at that point, I was certain she was following me. I tried to pinpoint where the voice was coming from, but could not, and it felt like she was deliberately changing her volume, so I could not tell if I was getting closer or farther away. I started to panic and took off running back toward home, and since I was running track at the time, I was confident I could lose her. I got home, kicked off my shoes, and turned on the television, and about 10 minutes into watching a show, I heard a girl's voice singing Camptown Races that was not coming from the television. For a moment, I just sat there in pure terror, unable to process what was happening. Then I ran outside barefoot and frantically looked around until I realized the voice was coming from above me, from the roof of the garage. I kept a ladder on the side of the garage so I could climb up there, and it was the only way up or down unless you wanted to jump and risk hurting yourself. I raced up the ladder and just caught sight of a figure in a red hoodie disappearing off the side of the roof toward the backyard, having jumped down without hesitation. I watched her sprint across my yard, completely unaffected by the fall, and clear our 6-foot fence like it was nothing. I briefly considered chasing her but could not in my bare feet, and honestly I am not sure I wanted to, and even though I do not believe in ghosts or anything like that, the whole experience still deeply unsettles me to this day. Story 15. My older sister is fairly clairvoyant and has been for as long as I can remember, always sensing things before they happen, like sudden deaths of friends or strange strokes of luck, and she often tells us long before they occur. She was living near an old hospital in Las Vegas and was walking home from the bus stop late at night after work when she felt something following her, which she described as a dark hulking shape about the size of a large Rottweiler but hunched at the shoulders. It moved far too fast to be a dog, darting from bush to bush along neighboring yards while making a direct path toward her, and as she hurried down the street it began laughing in a manic way while growling at the same time. She also noticed a strong smell of something rotten and sulfur like rotten eggs, and it followed her for nearly a quarter mile, shaking bushes beside her and trying to draw her attention. She did her best to ignore it and get home, but it was much faster than she was, and at one point it began making sounds as if it were speaking to her while continuing to laugh. She finally stopped under a street lamp, turned toward it, and yelled for it to go away and stop following her, at which point it paused, seemed confused, and then began to grow slightly larger while growling again. Just then, a neighbor came outside to go to work and saw my sister standing her ground and yelling at what he later described as a very large, twisted dog, telling it that it would find no victim there and that its words had no power. The neighbor told me it looked like the creature tried one last time to approach her before suddenly turning and shooting down the street faster than anything he had ever seen. And he also mentioned noticing red eyes, something he only brought up after I asked him to recount the story several times. About a week later, a boy in the neighborhood was arrested for killing his younger brother with a large hunting knife. And according to a newspaper article my sister read at the time, he told police that a demon came to his window every night whispering for him to kill his family, describing it as a hunched animal that laughed and growled while urging him to do it. Story 16. Once my father went camping at a non-commercial campground during early spring, the kind that is more secluded with no camp manager or facilities. And it was still very cold at night, so there were not many people camping at that time of year. There was only my dad, a few of his friends, and a rough-looking old Chevrolet truck with a makeshift Frankenstein-like camper mounted on it a few sites down. Being friendly and considerate campers, my dad and a couple of the other guys went over to say hello and let their neighbor know to speak up if they were being too loud during the weekend. The man they met seemed polite and kept to himself, thanked them for introducing themselves, and looked like he had been camping there for a few weeks already, with a clothesline set up and everything. During my father's 3-night stay, they waved at the man occasionally and even invited him over for coffee one morning. And after not seeing or hearing from him for a couple of days, they did not think much of it and finished their trip. On the way out of the campground, they passed his campsite, which was still set up exactly the same way as when they first met him. And as my dad was driving toward the exit, a friend in the truck shouted for him to stop because he thought he saw something. My dad caught it out of the corner of his eye as well, but assumed his mind was playing tricks on him, until he realized it really was the man hanging from a tree, and not a plastic bag meant to keep animals out of food. They all got out of their vehicles and called emergency services with spotty reception. And the scene was horrific, with the man's neck stretched thin from the weight of his body and his skin discolored. My dad remembers seeing a note attached to the tree with a hunting knife, but he was too disturbed to read it and still talks about how badly he wanted to cut the man down, even though he knew it was far too late. The police and ambulance eventually arrived, thanked them for reporting it, gathered information, and sent them on their way. The part that still unsettles me the most is that this happened at my dad's favorite campsite, where we were staying years later when he finally told us the story. And even though he waited until we were grown before mentioning it, it still sticks with me. Story 17. My life is generally very ordinary, but something happened to me while working at a summer camp, where counselors and campers stay overnight for a week at a time. I hated my assigned room because the bunk beds and walls felt too cramped, so I secretly started sleeping in the staff lounge instead, which had comfortable couches and felt much more like home. The lounge had a simple electronic lock that required a 4-digit code to enter, and sleeping there honestly made camp life much better until one night. Because it was summer and nights were usually warm, I did not use blankets as long as the ceiling fans were off, but that night I woke up shivering. I added a few couch cushions on top of myself and tried to fall back asleep, when I heard footsteps approaching the door, which was reached by about 5 creaky steps. I assumed someone was just coming in for a late-night snack and began to drift off again, until I heard the error beep from the keypad, meaning the code had been entered incorrectly. I brushed it off, thinking whoever it was had mistyped it, but then it happened again, and again, with another error beep each time. I was annoyed and started to sit up to call out the code, but froze when I heard yet another error beep. Every counselor knew the code by heart, campers were closely supervised at night, and there was no reason for anyone to struggle like that. I listened carefully, and after the 5th failed attempt, the footsteps began moving away down the stairs, but what followed was far more unsettling. I never heard breathing, never heard the carpet shift the way it does when someone turns around, which meant whoever it was walked straight back down the steps backward in complete darkness. The most terrifying part came after the footsteps faded, when I heard a small voice rise slowly from the bottom of the stairs toward my couch. quiet and unnatural, saying boo. Less than 2 seconds later, there was an enormous bang against a nearby wall, so loud that I screamed and completely lost control of myself in fear. No doors opened, no doors closed, and whoever or whatever it was should still have been inside the building, so I stayed frozen in place with wide eyes and strained ears until morning finally came. Story 18. There was a rash of killings and disappearances of young women in our town when I was probably 8 or 10 years old, and many of those women have never been found, even decades later. Fast forward about 20 years, and I was training a new employee who was around 15 years older than me, and at some point those disappearances came up in conversation. She told us about a time when she was at a bar and needed to make a phone call, but the payphone inside was too loud. And because of those abductions, she did not want to walk alone to the public phone down the street, even though it was a very well-lit area with a lot of traffic. So she decided to drive instead. Everyone at the bar teased her for being afraid of the boogeyman. She drove to the phone, made her call, and started talking, which back then only cost a single coin and had no time limit, so she was not really paying attention to her surroundings. She left her car running with the windows open because it was a hot summer night, with the radio on and the headlights lit so it would not feel creepy. When she got back into the car, a man suddenly popped up from the back seat. She started to turn around, but he placed his hands on her shoulders and said calmly that it was just him and not to be afraid, which only terrified her more. She started screaming and instinctively reached for her purse on the passenger side floor, and he grabbed her, pulled her back, gently placed his hands on the sides of her face, and began whispering, "Shh," in a soft, soothing voice, like someone comforting a child. For a moment, she thought it might be one of her friends from the bar playing a cruel joke, but then his hands moved to her throat and started squeezing while he kept whispering, "Shh." Somehow, she managed to slam on the horn, which startled him enough to release his grip, and she flung the door open and ran down the busy street screaming for help. One man later told police he thought it was just a lover's argument and did not want to get involved. To this day, she cannot wear anything tight around her neck, not even crew neck shirts. And sometimes, as she is falling asleep, she will suddenly hear that shh again and wake up flooded with adrenaline. I pass that corner almost every day, and it still terrifies me to think that the man was never caught and was likely responsible for the other disappearances as well. Story 19. My mother is mentally ill, and when I was 11 years old, I realized she was not just eccentric, but severely delusional and dangerous. I talked to my father, told him I was leaving, and asked if he was coming with me, and he began divorce proceedings soon after. Not long after that, one evening, she completely lost control and started throwing my great-grandmother's china at him. Not the nearly indestructible everyday dishes, but the valuable bone china with platinum trim. My father ran to the phone, which was before regular people could afford cell phones, and started calling the police. She ran down to the basement, and I immediately knew what she was doing, so I stood on the landing. Moments later, I saw the most terrifying thing of my life. My mother coming up the stairs with a look of pure rage and madness on her face, holding a rifle and trying to load it while climbing at the same time. I screamed that she had a gun, and my father and I ran out of the house through separate doors, ending up hiding together in the woods in the rain until the police arrived. People sometimes tell me I'm an unusually calm person, but the truth is that after you see your own mother with a look of insanity in her eyes and a gun in her hands, about to kill your father and possibly you as well, nothing else ever really compares. Story 20. I have countless stories from the house I grew up in, which was absolutely haunted by a presence, my childhood friend named Susie. I know many people are skeptical about ghosts, and my husband was too until he lived in that house with my parents and me for a year while we were dating, and now he believes. The house is an old farmhouse, and we believe the spirit was a girl who once lived there, and she seemed especially particular about men, which explains my husband's change of heart. The time I was probably the most frightened happened one night when my parents' bedroom was about 10 feet down the hall from mine, with our doors facing each other, and my dad was working nights, so my mom slept alone. My mom was always the brave one when it came to Susie, never showing fear even when strange things happened. At least not that I noticed as a child. One night she came into my room and woke me up, asking if I had been watching television or talking on the phone, even though it was around 2 or 3 in the morning and I had been sound asleep. I told her no, and she left. Then I heard her go upstairs and ask my brothers the same thing, and after getting the same answer, she returned to her room. Less than a minute later, she came back and asked me to sleep in bed with her, which terrified me because she never showed fear over anything strange in that house. She fell asleep almost immediately, while I lay awake for at least half an hour, scared out of my mind and holding on to her arm just to feel safe. The next day I asked her what happened, and she explained that she had heard something in the dining room that sounded like one of those children's toys that spins and lands on an animal while making noises, except this one was speaking complete gibberish. She said it started quietly and kept getting louder and louder, which is why she went to check on us. And the moment she stepped out of her room, the noise stopped. What made that night more disturbing than any other incident was not the sound itself, but how badly it frightened my mother. Story 21. I was 16 years old when this happened and living with my parents. And one morning I was getting ready for a friend to pick me up so we could meet up with a group of friends for some event that I no longer remember when my dad came into my room. He saw me getting ready and asked where I was going, and when I told him my plan, he asked me not to go. I scoffed and asked why, and he said he just wanted me to stay home that day. I had not looked at him yet because I was focused on getting ready. But when I finally did, I saw a look on his face I had never seen before. A mix of fear and concern so intense that it stopped me cold, and he did not even blink. I agreed to stay home if it would make him feel better, and he nodded and walked out. I had no idea what had just happened, but I texted my friend some excuse about being grounded. After that, I went to find my dad and asked if everything was okay, and although he said he was fine, I could tell something was wrong, and after pressing him, he finally told me what had happened. He said that during the night he woke up and saw me standing at the foot of his bed, smiling at him, and when he asked if I was okay and turned to fall back asleep, I did not answer. When he turned back over, I was fading away into the darkness, and he rubbed his eyes and assumed he had been dreaming, but the feeling unsettled him so badly that he got up to check on me. When he stepped into my room, he felt a deep chill run down his spine, watched me sleep for a moment, and then felt the same chill again as he crossed the doorway to leave, which unnerved him deeply. He eventually went back to sleep, but when he woke up, he had an overwhelming feeling that something bad was going to happen to me. And when he heard me getting ready that morning, he came in and asked me to stay home. Later that afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number, which turned out to be the mother of the friend who was supposed to pick me up, telling me that on his way to the event, he had been making a left turn when a truck ran a red light and smashed into the passenger side of his car, completely caving it in. My friend survived with a broken arm and a concussion, and he was alone in the car, and I was not with him. Story 22. When my parents first moved into my childhood home, they decided to turn a room in the attic into a nursery for their first child, which ended up being me 2 years later. And that room was always freezing cold, which was not surprising since the house was built in the late 1800s. What was strange was that immediately after I was born and moved into that room, it became one of the warmest rooms in the house. And my parents found it odd but convenient since they did not need to heat it for a baby. As time went on, strange things began happening, with wind-up music boxes slowing to a stop and then starting again on their own, and my parents hearing me giggle and move around as if I were playing after being put to bed. When I was old enough to speak in full sentences, they asked me who I was talking to at night, and I calmly told my mother that it was my old lady, and when she looked confused, I said she was right there in my closet. My mother brushed it off as an imaginary friend, but when I was around 3 years old and she was pregnant with my younger brother, I started telling her that my old lady was sad and lost, and around that time the room became freezing cold again, like it had been before I was born. My grandmother, who watched a lot of daytime television and believed children could see spirits, told my parents that children could help spirits move on by telling them to go toward the light, and they passed this idea along to 3-year-old me, and apparently I did just that. Fast forward 18 years later, and I was home alone from college one night using my laptop and browsing random websites, eventually looking up haunted locations in my hometown for fun, until I saw an entry listed under my exact home address. It was late at night, and I was completely alone in the house. And when I opened the page, the man who wrote it described owning the house in the 1970s and experiencing strange activity, including chasing an old woman from the attic down to the basement and photographing her near the water heater. When I saw the attached picture, I had a full panic attack because the woman in the photo was the same one I had seen over and over again in my childhood dreams and nightmares. Story 23. One summer night when I was 12 years old, I was watching television alone in my room late at night, and when I started getting tired, I turned everything off to go to sleep. I kept hearing rustling noises coming from the kitchen and assumed it was my stepdad, who was a night owl and often stayed up late. As I lay there, I started running through scenarios in my head, wondering what I would do if it was actually an intruder, including grabbing a knife from the kitchen counter that I had used earlier that evening and knew exactly where I had left it. My thoughts were interrupted when I heard someone walking down the hallway toward my room, and I quickly shut my eyes and pretended to be asleep as my door slowly opened. I could not keep my eyes still and opened them to see a tall, extremely thin man standing at the foot of my bed, leaning over to look at me, reminding me of Ichabod Crane, and he had to be at least 6'5". He reached a hand toward me and I jumped up and loudly told him to get out of my room. He immediately became apologetic and said he was looking for a friend who used to live there. And as we stood in the hallway, he asked to use the bathroom, which terrified me because my little sister was sleeping in the next room, but I agreed so I could check on her. She was fine, but when I turned back around, he was right behind me with his pants undone, and I ran straight to the kitchen, grabbed the knife I had pictured earlier, pointed it at him, and shouted for him to get out of the house. He started shaking, apologizing, and ran out the front door, which I locked behind him, and only then did the shock and adrenaline hit me. After calming myself, I woke my parents, and the police were called, and they dusted for fingerprints and determined that he had been watching me through the window at the back of the house, and that my room, being the last one down the hallway, was the only one he had approached. I identified him from a book of offenders at the police station the next day, and I still consider myself incredibly lucky and keep a knife by my bedside to this day. Story 24. When I was 16 years old, my brother, my dad, and I lived with a roommate who was about 35, and one day an old friend of his came over and stayed the night. The next day, my dad pulled me aside and explained that this man supposedly had brain cancer and was going to die soon, that he had traveled the world finishing his bucket list, had less than a week to live, and for some reason wanted to die in our house. He stayed for a few days, and I had a few heavy conversations with him, and I even lent him my camcorder so he could record a goodbye message for his daughter, which made it especially strange sleeping with him just in the other room. On about the fifth day, I came home from school to see police cars all over our block, and my dad told me the truth, that the man never had cancer at all, but was actually a fugitive wanted for assault and substance trafficking, and had been hiding in our house to evade the police. My dad had gone into the backyard and found him with a gun, about to kill himself, stopped him, and called the police, who took him into custody. Later, I watched the video he recorded on my camcorder, and it was eerily similar to the confession video in the first episode of Breaking Bad, and I think I still have that tape somewhere. Story 25. The scariest person I have ever encountered is someone I do not even know, and it happened when I was in college and flew to Kansas City to visit a friend for a weekend. I arrived around 9 in the evening, knew nothing about the city, and my friend did not have a car or a cell phone because his apartment was close to campus. So he walked to meet me at the bus station. We went back to his apartment, talked, drank, and had a great time. And before we knew it, the time had crept past 3 in the morning when there was a loud knock on the door that sounded like it was hit with something metal. Before my friend could finish checking it, a deep, guttural voice roared through the door shouting about free candy while continuing to pound on it. My friend quietly looked through the peephole and turned back with the color draining from his face, mouthing to me that we were going to die. We dropped to the floor and crawled behind the couch, then made our way to the back of the apartment and hid together in a closet as the knocking grew louder and more violent. When I asked what he had seen, he told me the man was at least 6.5 feet tall, muscular, completely naked except for a head covering, and holding a double-barreled shotgun, and his voice shook with disbelief as he described it. We waited in terror, feeling the pounding through the floor, knowing there was no phone, no car, no escape, and that we were on the fourth floor with no access to the stairwell. After about 15 minutes, the knocking finally stopped, the yelling ceased, and after waiting another half hour, we cautiously came out to find the hallway empty. The next morning, I rented a car, my friend bought a cell phone, and we filed a police report, but nothing ever came of it. Story 26. This happened about 12 years ago when I was living on the second floor of an apartment complex with my ex, and the building backed up against a golf course, which meant we often had strong, unobstructed winds blowing in, especially in the fall. One early evening, the sky was that deep autumn blue turning gray, perfect nap weather, and since I had a bad cold, I decided to lie down while my girlfriend stayed up playing a computer game in the other room. Our bedroom was large with a queen bed, two big dressers, and plenty of open space, and as I drifted off, I was oddly comforted by the sound of her typing, the wind outside, and my own breathing blending together. I had only been asleep for a few minutes when I woke suddenly with intense pressure in my head, my ears popping painfully as a metallic ringing sound rose and faded. As I tried to reposition myself, a thick, musky humidity filled the room, like swamp air on a hot day, and an oppressive darkness seemed to creep across the space, swallowing the faint light from behind the curtains. I noticed a shadow near the vent and focused my eyes until it resolved into what looked like a little girl, about 10 years old, sitting with her knees hugged to her chest, rocking slightly, her clothes soaked with mud and seaweed, and her skin gray and lifeless. I felt strangely calm, observing rather than reacting, until her eyes locked onto mine, and she let out a piercing shriek that made my ears ring again. In an instant, she launched herself at me, landing with crushing weight, her nails digging into my skin, and her hands closing around my throat as the smell of rot and stagnant water overwhelmed me. I tried to fight her off, but felt myself weakening, panicked and desperate, convinced I was about to die, until I twisted my body and managed to roll us both off the bed. I scrambled to my feet and ran from the room, collapsing in the living room in front of my shocked girlfriend, shaking, crying, and barely able to explain what had happened. When we went back into the bedroom, the bed was soaked with sweat, the sheets torn loose and pillows on the floor, though there was no mud or water, and while at the time I believed something supernatural had attacked me, I later came to believe it was an intense nightmare or sleep paralysis episode, though the memory still unsettles me deeply. Story 27. A former roommate of mine had an ex-girlfriend he stayed in regular contact with because of their son, and even though they were no longer together, they had a decent relationship and saw each other on the weekends, since she lived a few hours away. He once told me about how she began to feel like she was being watched when she went places and had a strange feeling whenever she came home. One night she came home late with their son asleep in his car seat, and as she got out of the car, she heard rustling in the bushes that sounded larger than a cat or raccoon. She quickly got her son out of the car and went inside her apartment, shaken but trying to calm herself. Later that night, her car alarm went off, and against better judgment, she went outside to check it. The driver's side door was wide open, and when she looked inside, she saw the passenger seat pulled all the way back into a reclined position. She locked the car and went back inside, deciding to leave it alone. A couple of nights later at 3 in the morning, she heard a very light knocking at her door, just loud enough to know someone was there, but quiet enough that no one else in the complex would hear it, and her son would not wake up. She had fallen asleep on the couch with her son, and slowly got up to look through the peephole, where she saw a man dressed entirely in black with a hood pulled over his head, staring down at the floor so his face could not be seen, continuing to knock in a steady, unsettling rhythm. She froze, terrified for herself and her son, and texted my roommate asking if it was him playing a joke, but he said it was not, and that he was leaving work immediately to come to her. She went back to the couch and sat there until morning, never calling the police. After that, she stayed with her parents until she could move, and with help from family, she eventually did, and nothing like that happened again. A few days later, my roommate texted me saying things had somehow gotten even creepier and explained that his young son had drawn a picture of that night. Both parents were very careful about what their child was exposed to and had never told him anything about the incident. And when my roommate showed me the drawing, it gave me chills because the child said he drew what he saw in a dream and it had scared him. And to this day, I believe she narrowly avoided something truly horrific. Story 28. This one is hard for me to talk about because I am 39 years old and it still unsettles me deeply. When I was 8 or 9 years old, I lived on Long Island and had a small group of close friends. But in the evenings, you stayed home and played in your yard rather than visiting friends. It was 1984 during the summer and a pleasant evening with full daylight around 7 in the evening. My parents were out at a late medical appointment, so my grandparents, who lived with us, were watching me. I loved riding my bike and was allowed to ride up and down our lightly traveled road and back, which made me happy. That evening, I decided to take a well-traveled path that led to the parking lot of a large church, ride across it, go down the main road for about 100 yards, and then turn back onto my street, making a small loop. I spent a few minutes practicing turns in the empty church parking lot when I noticed a man entering the lot from one of the exits. He appeared older, maybe in his 50s, with gray-white hair and tall enough that for a split second I thought he might be my dad. I rode toward him, then casually turned around when I realized I did not recognize him. Almost immediately I sensed something was wrong, and within moments he began chasing me, looking angry and threatening, and running far faster than I would have expected for his age. I managed to get some distance on my bike, though he gained on me at first, and I remember the terrifying feeling of my legs almost not working properly, like running in a dream. Before leaving the parking lot, I briefly considered ditching my bike and running to the church door for help, but the place was deserted, so I kept going. I reached the main road, turned onto it, then turned again onto my street, and saw him trying to cut me off by jumping a fence between the church and my road. I considered running to a friend's house at the start of my block, but there were no cars there, so I pedaled as hard as I could the remaining quarter-mile home. As I rode away, I glanced at him through the chain-link fence and made a rude gesture, which at the time felt like the only thing I could do. I made it home shaken and told my grandparents, and my dad later went looking for the man, but I never saw him again. That single incident affected me for years, making me avoid that area, and even as an adult, it still causes anxiety when I think about it. I truly believe that the decisions I made that night as a child are the reason I am alive today, and whenever I remember it, I remind myself that trusting my instincts likely saved my life. Story 29. This happened when I was younger, probably around 10 or 12 years old, and we lived at the bottom of a very steep hill where cars had to ride their brakes to obey the speed limit. Our living room sat at the front of the house with the couch pushed directly against the wall facing the road, and one night my sister and I planned to sleep downstairs so we could stay up late watching movies, setting up blankets and pillows for the night. I was supposed to sleep on the couch while my sister slept on a mat on the floor, but we got into an argument bad enough that my mom intervened and told us we were no longer allowed to sleep in the living room. And even though we were no longer mad at each other, we went upstairs angry at her for ruining our plans. The next morning I woke up to see an ambulance and a fire truck in our yard, and a wrecked pickup truck with a snowplow lodged in the woods near the house, and we learned that a drunk driver had lost control coming down the hill, hit a culvert, and crashed straight through the exact wall our couch had been against, shattering the glass and mangling the furniture before being stopped by a tree. To this day, it chills me to think about what would have happened if we had slept downstairs, and parts of the plow were still lying where the truck stopped long afterward. Not long after that, I had a separate experience in the same house where I woke up in the middle of the night and watched my clock change from 11:59 to midnight. And when I looked toward the door, I saw a dense, misty figure of a woman floating a couple of feet off the ground behind it, wearing a dress that moved as if there were wind in the room, even though there was none. She looked sad but calm, and although I was frozen and could not move or call out, I felt strangely comforted as if she were watching over me, and after several seconds, she slowly drifted backward and vanished. Another time when I was home alone with just my dog, he suddenly stood at the foot of the stairs with his teeth bared, growling and barking at something I could not see, and when I looked up the stairs, there was nothing there, yet every instinct in my body told me something was watching us from above. And even in the heat of summer, my skin crawled with cold until I dragged my dog away, and I still wonder what was really there.